I'm delighted to be here. As an urban planner, I like to go to cities. I enjoy cities. I've never been to Little Rock until today, and it's been pretty fantastic thus far. I've learned lots about your city in a short time. A few things I noted in my tour, some of it was self-guided, was that you have really one of the coolest streetcar systems. At least the streetcar is really cool. It looks like New Orleans. It's a really vintage, fantastic vehicle. I love that. I love getting down by the river. I walked on the river walk or the river trail today and enjoyed that greatly. There appears to be some kind of, I don't know if it's a Russian or German submarine down there. That's, I don't want to alarm anybody, but Skip, you might want to look into that. That was a little strange to see on the river. But mostly what I've enjoyed is having the red carpet rolled out for me. Had a great tour with Bob, thank you for that, at the library. And in particular that you guys invited me here on a hot day. That really helps me convey my messages when I have a hot day. And so thank you for planning that so well. This is less exciting when I do this in the winter. So I'm going to talk about three general topics related to urban climate change, and I know this is probably somewhat of a new topic to most people in the room, and so we will try to illuminate this and speak about it in terms that are clear and understandable. First, we'll talk about why urban climate change is different than the global scale phenomenon that I know we're all at least somewhat familiar with, and then talk about this statement, the party's not over, but it's getting wet and hot. We find ourselves in a rather curious moment in history where the climate in which our species has evolved and thrived has changed, and it's changed in a very significant way. And we don't fully recognize that or accept that. And so that is creating some unique vulnerabilities that I want to highlight. And then the laws of melting is a discussion of how our approaches to conveying information on climate change at the urban scale or elsewhere have not been very effective in getting people activated or really engaged in the issue. And so I want to highlight that as well and conclude on that. So August 14th of 2003 was another hot day. I don't know if it was hot in Little Rock. It was hot in New York. And it was made even hotter by the fact that the power went out. When the power goes out in a city like New York, that is an event. For some people, that's a fun event, and so if you're someone much younger than me, maybe the age of a student, you might have enjoyed this. Bars opened up their wares, restaurants opened up their wares, they had to give away their food and their alcohol and everything else, otherwise it was going to spoil. If you were of my cohort, you had to walk home to get back to your family and your kids. And that's not a fun thing to do. Many of us have probably walked the Brooklyn Bridge, but to do it in this kind of weather is not fun. To do it with the rest of humanity is also not fun at all. This was actually a blackout that was the result of a hot day, a transmission corridor in Ohio. The high power transmission lines actually physically sagged because the electrical demand was so high that day that they physically sagged and came in contact with some trees that hadn't been trimmed and really shorted out a significant part of the northeastern corridor and created cascading blackouts. We had 55 million people without power. In a city like New York, it doesn't take long to reflect on how electricity is fundamental to existence there. It gets you from 101st Street to 86th Street on the subway. It gets you from the ground floor to the 71st floor in your building. It delivers your water to the 71st floor in your building. And so this lasted about 36 hours in New York. And even during that short period of time, they estimate that about 100 additional people died. People are dying in New York all the time. Don't mean to be morbid about that, but a significant number of excess deaths of trying to deal with the heat and negotiate a city without electricity. This is a particular vulnerability of cities dealing with heat, cities dealing with climate change, that's different than areas that are not in cities. And so what I want to highlight today is the significance of climate change in cities and the unique vulnerabilities that it creates. there is somewhat of a disconnect between the global scientific community and cities, and there are different ways to convey this, but one way is to just look at the major assessment reports. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the major global scientific body that is issuing reports every 5 to 6 to 7 years. And it really wasn't until this most recent report in 2013 that we had a specific chapter on urban areas and what's unique about cities. Unique vulnerabilities, also just the unique science, why cities are experiencing climate change that's a little different than places that are not urbanized. And so the need for emphasis on this is played out in many ways. This graphic is from this most recent assessment. And what it shows here is in the region of the country where we find ourselves, in Little Rock, and where I live in Atlanta, a cooling trend over most of the 20th century is that this region of the country has been cooling. That's kind of strange and counterintuitive to see when the rest of the planet has been warming up pretty rapidly. But we know that there's been lots of reforestation over the 20th century in the Southeast, largely because the cropland is just not as productive as the Midwest or California, and so the demand hasn't been as great. In highlighting the cities here in the Southeast, it gives you the impression that cities have been cooling down, but they really haven't been at all. If we look at actual urban weather data, we'll see that this is average data for a number of southeastern cities, and that they've been heating up, at least over the last 50 years of this period. And so one of the reasons that we see this kind of weird association between cooling in the region and warming up in the city is that the data that's used for this map, if we can go back, is all based on rural weather stations. When NASA measures climate change globally or in the United States, or NOAA does, they use just rural temperature stations. And they do that because they know the urban temperature stations are subject to warming from more than just greenhouse gases. Urban weather stations are warming up from all the parking lots and the roads and the houses and the waste heat. And so they pull that data out. And so if you are kind of by design looking at how rural places are warming, which is a reasonable thing to do, you're missing a lot of what's happening in cities. And so my research group is very much focused on how rapidly are cities warming relative to what's around them, because we need to be preparing for this in cities. And we need to know how rapidly this is happening. And so what this shows, this is as technical as I'll get. I'll try not to get too technical. This shows warming trends in rural areas outside of cities over the last 50 years. And then in the cities themselves, it's measured as an anomaly, which is a fancy word, which isn't really fancy. It's just deviation from a long-term average. And so this zero line here is the average temperature between 1961 and 1990 for the United States. So if we set that at 0, how do these areas differ from that long-term average? And what they show is that in rural areas, these rural weather stations outside of cities have been heating up over this period. And so any area here that's above this 0 line is a warming trend that is clearly associated with increasing greenhouse gases globally. In rural areas, we're not seeing a lot of parking lots being developed. We're not seeing a lot of buildings. If we were, we wouldn't call them rural areas anymore. And so this is kind of the global greenhouse effect is causing this. Cities are also being warmed by those greenhouse gases that are driving this warming here. But in addition, this distance between the red curve and the orange curve here is this additional warming that we associate with the urban heat island effect, which is this technical term, which is all the warming that's happening in cities that really isn't related to greenhouse gases. And so what we conclude from this is that cities are warming or hotter in every year than rural areas. We know that because of the heat island effect. Cities, most of the warming that's happening in cities is actually because of the heat island. It's not because of greenhouse gases. In the most recent decade, it's about 50-50. And cities are warming up more rapidly than rural areas. And so why is this important? Well, if you are the mayor of Little Rock or the mayor of Atlanta or an urban decision maker, you might be interested in how soon do I need to prepare for all these terrible things that are discussed with respect to climate change? How soon are people going to be getting sick from heat? How soon might we be seeing things like flooding and sea level rise? If we assume that cities are warming as fast as the planet is, 0.3 of a degree per decade doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is for the global scale. We'll be underestimating the actual rate of warming for most U.S. cities by quite a bit, by about 50%. And so cities tend to be warming at double the rate at what's around them. And so it's a very rapid rate of warming. And we may notice that if we've lived in Little Rock for a long time or lived anywhere, we may notice that or we may not because we acclimate to it. But its temperatures have really changed. If you were in Little Rock in the 1960s, I can promise you this summer has been a lot hotter. And so that has implications that we need to be aware of. Why is this there kind of a confusion between what's happening at the global scale and what's happening in cities? Part of it comes from the technical definition of climate change, which comes from this Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. It's defined as a change in climate which is attributable directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere. And so we understand climate change, technically, as being driven really only by greenhouse gases. But cities are warming primarily from things other than greenhouse gases. And so cities are warming up because of greenhouse gases, just like the planet is. But they also have these 4 other processes happening. One is we're cutting down lots of trees in cities, at least where we have trees, like in Little Rock. Loss of vegetation heats up the environment. It heats it up even before we put in the parking lots and the streets and the houses. It heats it up because trees shade, we're all familiar with that, but they also cool the air through evaporation and transpiration, just releasing water vapor that the leaves do. Really cools down the air. And so when we cut down trees, this is a picture of the Amazon. When you cut down trees in the Amazon, you actually are heating up the environment without having cities come in. In cities, of course, we cut down the trees and then we put in streets and houses and parking lots. Those materials absorb a lot of heat energy, store that energy, and that heats up the air. We emit a lot of waste heat from our cars when we burn gasoline or diesel or whatever we burn. We emit a lot of waste heat along with other emissions. That contributes to warming in cities. And then urban morphology is another fancy term for just the 3-dimensional shape of downtown districts. The buildings themselves trap a lot of heat energy. And so these 4 drivers together are what we call the urban heat island effect, this technical term. And recently, cities have been warming from about half of that is the global greenhouse effect, about half of that is the urban heat island effect. So this is a big issue. The global science community, for the most part, has been focused just on greenhouse gases. And so if we develop policies to manage these in cities, we're going to have a hard time really cooling down cities as they're warming up. If Little Rock were to zero out all its greenhouse gases tomorrow, it would not cool down for several hundred years. If the planet were to zero out greenhouse gases tomorrow, everywhere, Little Rock would not cool down for a couple hundred years. It's depressing to say it, but it's the best science tells us that. And so if we're going to address extreme heat in cities, we've really got to focus on these issues that we haven't been as focused on historically. And so that's basically what I'm here to talk about tonight. This is Chicago in 1995. This is the deadliest heat wave in the United States in our history. Over a few days, about 800 people died from heat. It's a pretty big number. We think of catastrophic weather as hurricanes and tornadoes, but every year in the U.S., if we average it, about 50 people die a year from tornadoes. I mean, that's tragic, and that's acute loss of life. Hurricanes, less than 10 people a year die from hurricanes on average. We have years like Katrina, which were really dramatic, but on average, not many people die. About 800 to 1,000 people die every year from heat, just hot weather in the United States. It's the deadliest form of extreme weather. It's deadlier than all other forms combined, but we don't really take it as a serious threat, and I think that's something that we need to change our thinking about. Okay, the party's not over, but it's getting wet and it's getting hot. This is one of my favorite recent images in my little climate change file of images. This is from Venice, Italy, from a few years ago. There's an annual high tide. It's called the king tides. When the sun and the moon align and really pull on the ocean, you get some really high tides. It's a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's always been occurring. When you add sea level rise to that high tide starts to creep into cities, just like storm surge starts to creep into cities. And so this has become somewhat of a regular event in lots of cities, certainly in U.S. cities, Miami. I'll show you a slide from Fort Lauderdale. And so what I love about this is it's kind of weird to be going to buy cappuccino with 6 inches of water in the cafe and to have these Italian pastries. That's kind of unusual, but people adapt. They get their rain galoshes and they adapt. We're in this weird space where for a time the water's only going to be this high, and so we can just put on our boots and get our cappuccino. But soon enough, the water's going to be higher. And this is what concerns me, is that we're really not preparing for the day when the water's higher. And we should be doing a lot more, because there's great certainty that the water's getting higher. This is a piazza in Venice, same weather event. This is my friend in Fort Lauderdale. This is a perfectly sunny, beautiful day. This is not because it's raining hard. This is because the storm sewers are channeling water from the high tides to residential areas into the city. What he describes here is actually wrong. The storm drain is functioning perfectly well. It's just functioning in reverse. It's bringing the water from the ocean to the land. And so, again, this is kind of, we're in that phase where this is kind of novel. This is kind of fun. I'm going to go swim in the front yard. That's fine, until we get up to the threshold. Next year or the year after, it's going to get in the house, and that will not be fun. That will not be fun, and that's a day we need to be preparing for. Stormwater flooding is a clear threat to us, but heat also has real direct infrastructure threats to us. I promise I didn't Photoshop this. This actually happens. Kinking rail lines. This is from New Zealand, from a really hot period there. You usually don't see it that dramatically, but it doesn't take a lot of malalignment to become a problem for a train. This is Reagan National Airport. Hard to see, there's softening of the tarmac. So it's so hot out that the tarmac is softening, you can't move planes when they sink into the runway. This is essentially rupturing concrete on I-65 in Illinois. All these materials are designed to be exposed to high temperatures, but not for days and days and weeks on end. And so as we get hotter and hotter, and last year was the hottest year ever, this year appears to be even hotter than that. As that continuously occurs, we're really going to have to start to think about resurfacing our cities, and that's a big job. We've got a lot of big jobs in cities, and we weren't thinking that, we've got to repave the city too. So we have these vulnerabilities that are associated with changing environment, changing climate, stress on infrastructure, stress on health. But a huge vulnerability is driven by the fact that we don't believe it. I mean, it's happening all around us, but in this country in particular, we don't believe it. And so the peer-reviewed studies, the scientific literature is almost unanimous on this, that yes, humans are driving global warming. The global greenhouse effects first appeared in scientific textbooks in the United States in the 1930s. It's been accepted science for a very long time. There are a few, the sliver is here, there are a few people who are well-credentialed who say, no, humans are not driving climate change, and we can put a lot of faith in them. But there are also some really well-credentialed academics who don't believe in the theory of gravity. There are always going to be very smart people who have a different view, but when the vast majority of the scientific community globally says, absolutely, this is happening, it's time to take action. Most of us either don't know what to believe because there's so much information out there, misinformation, or we don't believe it. And so we've got these two threads of vulnerability. One is the weather's changing, the climate's changing, and one is we're not preparing for it because we don't believe it. And I'm not sure which vulnerability is greater. We can look at Miami. The condo market is booming. South Beach is booming at a period where we know that this is going to be inundated with the ocean in not much longer. To be buying a condo in Miami right now, right on the water, is an amazing thing to do. It really, no offense if you're doing this, but I want to talk to you after I finish talking. This is unique. This is a distorted market because the state of Florida has decided to be the insurer of last resort, because most private insurers will not insure a condo in South Beach because they know that condo is going to be underwater. But the state has said, we'll insure you because if we lose the real estate market, we lose a lot of our growth potential. So we have some kind of irrational behavior. Not just in terms of infrastructure and sea level rise, the threat to public health is immense, and it's not a future threat. I get concerned about so much of the climate discussion is focused on the future, on mid-century or 2100, or focused on Antarctica. These are things that are already happening, and so how many people remember the heat wave in Europe in 2003? Does anybody remember hearing about this? It's really just a few hands. This was the deadliest natural disaster in a developed part of the world ever. This was about 10 weeks of really hot weather in Western and Northern Europe, a region where there's not a lot of air conditioning. and a lot of people succumbed to the heat. This is a Parisian cemetery where the public health system was so overwhelmed with the number of heat mortalities that they just had to put people in common graves until they could identify them. And these graves are still there today. 70,000 people died in one summer from the heat, just from the heat, extreme heat. If we compare that to other weather-related disasters or just other things we're familiar with that were disastrous, we can see that's a big number. The red bars here, the tsunami of Japan we all saw was horrific. 20,000 people died in a very short period of time. That was horrific. 9/11, obviously not a weather-related event, but 4,000 people died, roughly. Katrina, we've been hearing a lot about Katrina in the last few weeks. It's the 10-year anniversary, about 1,500 people died. So this red, the red here suggests a real vulnerability from changing climate, but what is even more probably problematic for us are these orange bars. For me, and I'm an academic, I think about things in terms of number of books published, but this is really just a proxy for how aware are we of these events. Very few people have even heard of this. I can't find a book written in any language about this. This is the deadliest weather-related disaster in a developed part of the world. 70,000 people, that's a lot of people dying in one summer. This tells us a lot about where we're going, but we're not aware of it. And so that's an acute vulnerability. This is an academic way of describing what I've just been discussing is we've been in a period of great climate stability for a long time. And so we have variability in the climate, but it's within some range. And because it's within that range, we don't have that many extreme events. And when we do, we're somewhat prepared for it. We can manage it. It's not to say people don't get sick and get ill and die, but it's manageable. When you shift into a new climate regime where you have instability, it's time for that resilience and expanding adaptation. It's time to start taking action so you can manage that change. This is kind of where we are today. We've moved into that period of a new climate, but we're not adjusting. And that makes us particularly vulnerable. And so that vulnerability plays out in ways that we can see. Some ways are significant and dramatic, and some ways are really not dramatic at all, but they're very telling. Again, there's been a lot of discussion of Katrina lately, and it's been described by many people as a human-made disaster. And it was a human-made disaster in many respects, in that we knew a storm of that intensity. It wasn't even quite that intense when it hit New Orleans. Was quite likely that there would be a kind of a direct hit on New Orleans. We knew that for a long time. You didn't even need climate change to make that happen. We had simulated this, just in the year prior, but we just didn't believe it. We didn't believe it enough to actually prepare for it. And so what played out was really a dramatic event, and one that was very, very costly in life and infrastructure. So what this says, you can't see the whole thing. The need for public preparedness is high when individual preparedness is low. And that's really, directed the students here, moving into the realm of public service. The burden on government agencies or nonprofits, for example, to prepare for dealing with these kinds of crises is all the more greater when individuals are not prepared. And so part of that is preparing infrastructure for this, and part of it is trying to prepare society for this. The less maybe dramatic events, the more familiar events, perhaps, the more common events, I think, are the more telling about where we are. This is last week at the U.S. Open. More retirements, more of the fittest athletes in the world saying, I cannot play tennis in this weather, or trying to play and collapsing than have ever happened before. The Australian Open last year in 2014 was also similar. There were periods of this that they had to put it on hold. It was so hot, it got to be 110 degrees while they're trying to have tennis matches. It's these types of phenomena, more so I think than the dramatic storms. Those are dramatic and they're a signal to us, but this is a signal to us too, that quietly, slowly, the world is changing and we really need to be preparing for it. Okay, the laws of melting, things that melt, things you care about melting. These may be different things. So Greenland, Antarctica, they are melting. Land sheets of ice are melting, and that's problematic for sea level rise. The fact that we spend a lot of time in my world, in the realm of climate science and policy, talking about that, I think is particularly unuseful. President Obama has been doing a great job of trying to highlight the significance of climate change and doing what he can to bring about action on it. But I think, he recently visited Alaska to highlight climate change. I would not have made that decision. I would have gone to Chicago or New York or Los Angeles or Phoenix, and I would have really highlighted how people's lives in places where most of us live are already changing from this. I think that's a more direct and important message. So the remainder of my talk focuses on this. Making climate change closer to home, localizing the impacts. This is a campaign in Vancouver, which is using barnacles and shells to show, where sea level's projected to be potentially in the future. That's rather arresting to walk outside of your apartment and be like, oh, I'm underwater. Maybe this is something that I should be aware of or concerned of. This is Climate Central is a group that's really taken this as their mission. Just trying to visualize what climate will be like down the road in Little Rock. So high temperature is projected to put Little Rock in a climate that is more similar to Mexico, to northern Mexico, by the end of the century. And so that's one way to think about this. Taking action where we live. This is an analysis from a student of mine in Chicago. And what he's showing is Chicago neighborhoods, single blocks that are actually very close together, but have very different temperature profiles, this being much cooler. Roughly the same number of houses, but over here we see much more tree cover, we see fewer ancillary buildings, fewer garages, and so ultimately we have cooler temperatures, but happening very close by. We can see this maybe in a park, very, very close in space. And so there are things we can do at the urban scale to cool down cities, to slow the rate at which they're warming, and that's a big focus of what my group is concerned about today. And so specifically, if we increase the amount of tree cover in cities, if we use green roofs, I know there's a fantastic green roof on the Clinton Library next door, that's a help. Green walls, cool materials are just more reflective materials. If you've been to the Mediterranean, to Greece or Northern Africa, you would note there's a lot of whitewashed construction, a lot of whitewashed buildings. They're using that because it reflects the heat away. It's a natural or a kind of a climate responsive design technique. No reason we can't design like that today in the US, and then reducing waste heat through energy efficiency programs. How beneficial is this to cities? I'm going to share with you a few slides. I mentioned before that we measure how rapidly cities are warming around the United States, and Louisville, Kentucky shows up at the top of our list, and really by quite a bit. I mean, it's warming much more rapidly than even Phoenix, the next closest city. I'm always proud to say Atlanta's number 3 here, but at least we're not number 1. So why is Louisville warming so rapidly? They're concerned about it, and so they've asked us to develop a heat management plan for them. What should we do about this? And so we're working on that now. Now, if you've been to Louisville, there are parts of Louisville neighborhoods that are absolutely amongst the most beautiful in the country. Leafy and green. Louisville has the largest intact Victorian district. Worth visiting if you go there. But many of the neighborhoods look like this, blocks where there's not a single street tree, not a single tree in a front yard. And that's actually pretty hard to find. I travel around cities quite a bit, and I'm always kind of looking, is there a street here that doesn't have a single street tree? Maybe in Phoenix, but not in a city like Louisville. And so that's really a problem. Downtown, also very sparse tree canopy downtown. And it's not that they've died, they just never really made room for them. There's no places to plant trees here. Louisville is unique in that it's one of the only major cities of the top 50 we looked at. It's only one of 2 that doesn't have any kind of tree protection ordinance. There's no protections for trees in Louisville, and so you don't need to plant them, and you can cut them down. And so the result is, this is hard to orient if you're not used to it. It says Central Business District. So the downtown district of Louisville, I'm going to show you a few of these maps, has a very sparse tree canopy. It's actually 8% downtown. That's really low. That's really low. And so in the place where you have the most concrete and asphalt, you really need to be cool, they have very little of it. And so here and in these in-town neighborhoods, really just there's almost like this dividing line, very sparse tree canopy cover. If we look at temperatures, you can see it follows that pattern very closely. It's not just the trees, it's a range of things, but trees really play a role here. And so what we're looking at here is a map unlike any you've seen before. I can promise you that. This is not surface temperature, this is air temperature. It's not measured directly, it's modeled with a regional climate model. Most large cities have 1 or 2 or 3 weather stations where you can measure temperature. Makes it really hard to figure out why one neighborhood is hotter than another and what's going on. And so with a climate model, we can simulate this at what ends up being a very fine scale for a climate model. And so this is, for every about 6 city blocks, we can estimate the temperature very precisely because we can compare it to weather observations we have. And it's pretty precise. And so this is a map we just created in the last month, and there's not really another one out there like it. So this is temperature. These are high temperatures. These are average high temperatures over the summer. And so when we see like 90 degrees here on the high end, it's bleached out a little bit. That's that red category. That is an average over 5 months. And so that actually is a really high temperature. There are a lot of days that were higher than 90 degrees in those areas. If we, because we have a climate model, we can say, well, what happens if we plant trees in the places where we know there's room for trees? If we plant trees in these areas that are really sparsely vegetated, and so we can increase this maybe by up to 30% here is what we've done by looking in the places that are available. This is what the tree cover would look like. This is what temperature looks like. So you may not remember, I'll show you here on the next slide, but this was all in red, and now we're in the middle category. So we've seen about a 2 to 3 degree reduction in average summer type temperatures. So that's before trees, but also cool materials and some waste heat programs, and this is after. And every district here, every neighborhood has seen a fall in temperature that's equivalent to 2 of these categories at least. It's about 2 to 3 degrees. As for a single summer afternoon, doesn't sound like a lot, but that's over the entire summer as an average. This translates into 4, 5, 6 degrees in terms of temperature. And so cities can do this, can cool themselves down or slow their rate of warming on their own, and they can do it with the kinds of policies that are typically good for the city anyway. This is a map of where we think people are getting ill and potentially dying from heat during the summer. It's a little washed out, but you can see, there's quite a bit that in this high category. Oops, I keep wanting to use this. The red here is distributed well. Regions that are highly industrial, we don't have a lot of people living there, like the airport, and so you don't see many people dying there. This is what would happen if you implemented these policies. What kind of reduction could you see in the number of people dying during the summer from a heat wave? 30 to 40%, even more than 40% in some of these residential districts. That's a big change. That's a significant reduction in heat risk just by doing things that are kind of good for the city. These are my last 2 slides here. So climate to order, this is 1949 from a San Antonio paper, and what it's foreseen is the ability to control climate. We had a lot of these in the early 20th century. We were foreseeing lots of pretty dramatic things. Nobody saw the iPhone, but they definitely saw people flying around in spaceships to get to work, and just all kinds of dramatic things, some of which are here. This is showing the little scientists at work in the roof we've put over Manhattan to control the weather. And this is, in one sense a ludicrous idea, but in another sense it's entirely what we need to do. And convincing urban policymakers that we can control the weather is sometimes an uphill battle, but the most important thing to recognize is that we already have. In developing the city, we've dramatically changed the weather, we've dramatically changed the climate, and we can modify it in another direction as well. So a few closing thoughts. Population vulnerability to climate change in cities may be higher today than it will be at any time in the future. And I say that realizing that weather events are going to continue to get more intense over time, but we are very ill prepared for this right now, and that makes us particularly vulnerable, and that's an area that I think anyone who's public service minded needs to be thinking about. Climate adaptation requires that the phenomena be localized, contextualized, translated policy relevant information. Really trying to help people understand how climate change in the places they live, I think, is the most powerful way to communicate what's happening. That cities compound the rate of warming through land development is a liability for them. Cities are hotter, they have more of a heat burden to deal with, but they also control their own climate destiny. We don't need to wait for the international community to pass a treaty. We don't need to wait for the US Congress to pass a bill. Cities can do this now. And so I'll close with this slide. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I think that's very much where we are. Most of the things that we're recommending are things that we should just do anyway because we want to improve the quality of life in cities. It can also deal with climate. So Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. Can we do some questions?
Absolutely.
All right, questions. Yes, sir, right. Wait for the microphone. We'll get the microphone to you.
Coming to you.
Why is Louisville such an outlier?
It's a great question. And so part of that answer, I think, is because of the tree canopy issue. They really have very few trees downtown. And so that it is one of the most sparsely vegetated major cities that is that's east of the Mississippi. It's also just because the Ohio River Valley has lots of stagnant weather systems, lots of hot air systems that come through. And so there are a lot of heat waves, Detroit, Chicago. I mean, if you've ever spent time there or lived there in the summer, they get very hot. They get really hot up there. And so part of it is just having bad meteorology that they have no control over. But a lot of it is to do with the fact that they have very little vegetation and they haven't tried to design around heat issues. But it is a very unique place. It's very hot.
I've always heard that climate and weather are different, in that climate's long-term, weather's day-to-day.
Yeah.
But I've heard you using the terms interchangeably tonight.
Yeah.
So could you explain?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very fair question. Climate, of course, drives weather. And so as climate changes, weather changes. That when we're talking about the experience of people in cities on a day-to-day basis, and we're talking about events like heat wave events that are happening over 3 or 4 or 5 days, it's a weather event. It's a weather event that is growing more intense because of climate, but it is a weather event. And I think it's harder to relate as a non-scientist to climate because it sounds like a large system, a slow-moving system, something that may be in the future, something that may be somewhere else. But we are seeing weather changes that are driven by climate change. And cities can modify their environment such that they can modify the intensity of short-term climate events like heat waves. They can modify the weather. So I think both terms at this point and at this scale are appropriate. But technically, you're exactly right. They're different things. They really are.
Yes, sir. Right here. What, the microphone's coming at you.
Hey.
How do you answer people when you're discussing this and they say, well, the world has a history of cyclic weather. You've got glaciers and you've got
All kinds of things. You've got a solar cycle. You've got El Nino. So we have all these cyclical climate-related events that have been there for a long time, and that we can measure. The way to answer it is just with the science, is that we are now able to measure those short-term phenomena. One of the reasons I showed you 50 years of data for the cities is because none of those phenomena are operating on that scale. They tend to be shorter in nature. And so we are able now, with the science, if you read through the assessment reports that I listed, it's a heavy lift to read through them. I can point you to something that's more easily digestible. But the ability to measure those shorter term cycles and use those individually or in concert to explain the amount of warming that we've measured, because we've got to remember, I mean, when we see that the temperature is increasing, we're just measuring that directly. We can see that historically from thermometers. And so we cannot mathematically, from what we understand about these short-term events, have that add up to the amount of warming we've seen. And so we know if we mathematically factor in the greenhouse effect and how greenhouse emissions are driving warming, it perfectly explains what we're seeing. Almost perfectly, at least over a long period of time. And so the science, again, it can be complicated, but it's very well supported. And so the best way I think to defend that is just with the science itself. There's some websites that are out there that do a very good job of that. There's some books that do a very good job of that. But ultimately, you really got to come equipped with your facts to deal with that as a critique.
How does the heating up of cities correlate with air conditioning?
It correlates pretty well. So, cities, we've got two phenomena that have been playing out historically. I don't know if you're asking more of a historical question, but in the Southeast or in a region like we're in now, the real development curve followed the dissemination of air conditioning. So the ability to live down here in the summer and have it be tolerable fueled rapid land development. And so that rapid land development, in turn, has caused cities to heat up quite a bit. So that's part of it. Those things have happened in parallel, enabling one another. The other piece of this is that air conditioning itself is driving warming because we are mechanically removing the heat from the building and releasing it outside. If you have a city like Manhattan or Tokyo, as much of half of the heat island can be from just doing that, from pulling that energy inside the building and putting it outside. So air conditioning itself, this is kind of this negative feedback loop we find ourselves in. It gets hotter because of climate change. We use more air conditioning. The air conditioning makes it hotter. We get more climate change. So that's a real challenge.
Of the measures you've discussed that can reduce some of the climate increase or change in major cities, planting trees on top of buildings or more energy efficient buildings or maybe converting to something like solar power, how much of the crux of the problem lies with general awareness of some of these measures, and how much of it is maybe a pushback from something like an electrical company that doesn't want to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think with global scale climate change and greenhouse gases, there have been very well crafted campaigns of misinformation. That's pretty well documented. I think with the urban healing effect, that's not true. I think just most people aren't aware, even due to the fact that the global science community doesn't really highlight it, how much of the warming in cities is driven by things that aren't related to greenhouse gases. And so I don't think there's really, an electric utility that's there that's trying to work against these things. I mean, electric utilities for a long time have had programs that have been about trying to reduce the cooling load on your house because building new power plants is actually really expensive for them. And so if you can plant trees near your house, or have more insulation in the winter, or have cooler roofing materials, that tends to be in the interest of the utility itself. So I'm not sure there's a strong opposition to this. There's just not much of a demand for it because residents aren't aware of the science very well, and city leaders aren't aware of the science very well. Good question, though. You go.
Let me just push back against that a
Yeah,
little bit because
sure.
last time I walk in my neighborhood, I've lived there 15 years, and they've cut down 30 trees. I've been counting.
Yeah.
And usually it's homeowners who are cutting down these trees. But last summer, after I think it was actually after the New York power outage.
Okay.
The electric company came through and whacked all the way down.
Yeah.
Every possible branch, not just every branch that could maybe fall on a line, but every branch that might have ever thought about an electric company or an electric line.
Yeah.
So maybe they're not supporting it, but they're certainly not being smart about the things that they are doing.
Yeah, no, it's a very fair observation, and I wouldn't disagree at all, and you see that in a lot of cities, and that, we've seen even more of that since it's not just heat waves. You might be referring to Hurricane Sandy. Since these really dramatic events where you've got high winds, you've got trees coming down, pulling down the power lines, that's a major issue for power companies, of course. I mean to say that the concept, the idea that cities should be cooled down, there are not a lot of utilities that want cities to be hot so they can make more money selling us air conditioning, because actually there's so much cost for them to do that. But you're exactly right. There's a lot of lack of information for the utility side on the benefits of those trees for cooling down and reducing heating load, and it's a constant struggle. That and billboards and other types of things that cut down urban trees, because most cities are losing urban trees.
I know
So
there are more questions, but we have to bring this to a conclusion. But please come up and visit with Brian at the conclusion of the program, and let's give him a round of applause for a great program.